Saints go marching out. Okay. Well, that was wonderful for me. Let's thank Mr. John Walker. That was. And that was the first time that I've ever had the great privilege of watching someone else introduce the conference. That was great. It explained the clear hue and the cup of inconvenience. And good luck to the winners. All right. You know, I was here just a month ago. We had our Chesterton Schools Network Conference right here in this very space in June. And it's really something to think about the growth of the Chesterton Schools Network. Because in 2018, I think it was when we were in Orlando, the Chesterton Schools Conference was held right after the Society Conference, and it was just one conference room table of people sitting around one conference room table. And this year, there were more people here for the Chesterton Schools Network than are here tonight. So it's amazing. But the Schools Network is one of the projects of our Chesterton Society, and we are doing the same work. The work is the same. Just like Chesterton said, St. Francis and St. Thomas Aquinas did the same work. One did his work in the street, the other did it in the study, but in the same, in either case, it was, the work is bringing people into the kingdom of God. And that's what we continue to do. Yeah. Our work is making saints. All right, now let's see if this really does this. Oh, look at that. Nice. Empires break, industrial conditions change, the suburbs will not last forever. What will remain? I will tell you. The Catholic saint will remain. Now that line was not written by a Catholic. It was written by G.K. Chesterton before he was a Catholic. And where does the line come from? Anyone? Who said the ball on the cross? Well, I guess I was the only one who was right then, wasn't I? All right. Now, why is this non-Catholic writing about the permanence of the Catholic saint? The human race has always admired the Catholic virtues, however little it can practice them. And oddly enough, it has admired most of them that the modern world most sharply disputes. In a world of self-promotion, people still admire humility. In a world of war and violence, people still admire patience, which would bring peace if it were practiced. And in a world of lust, people still admire purity, however much they dispute it. That line, by the way, also was not written by a Catholic. That was written by G.K. Chesterton before he became a Catholic. And does anybody know what that line comes from? The answer is the ball and the cross. But it brings up the point that the virtues are connected to the saints, and the saints are connected to the virtues. Catholic virtue is often invisible because it is normal. Christianity is always out of fashion because it is always sane. And all fashions are mild insanities. Virtue is normal. It doesn't mean it's popular. It doesn't mean it's fashionable, but virtue is our normal state. That's the state we are supposed to be in, is in one of virtue. If we're not in that state of virtue, well, we're supposed to go to confession, aren't we? We're supposed to get our souls back into a state of grace, which is a state of virtue. Sanity is normal. Even if most people are insane, sanity is still the normal condition. It's the condition we're supposed to be in, and it's also often not fashionable. And yes, this line was not written by a Catholic. It was written by G.K. Chesterton before he became a Catholic. And it's from The Ball and the Cross. All right, we're going to do this for the next 45 minutes. Perhaps Chesterton's own greatest virtue is humility. If pride is the worst of the 7 deadly sins, then humility is arguably the greatest of the virtues, because it's certainly the most necessary virtue. It makes all the other virtues possible. Chesterton maintains that cultivating even one virtue is a step towards God. When he came to America, he met a Catholic woman professor who taught a course on Dante. And she said how difficult it was to explain to Protestant students the degrees in heaven and hell, and that how the will shaped them. And he responded, yes, and even more difficult to explain how one sin can make a hell, and one act of virtue make a beginning of heaven in the soul. I once heard a state Supreme Court justice, I won't say which state because you'll immediately have a prejudice against Minnesota, but this was actually one of the good ones, and he said that the world's problems would be solved if everyone just followed one commandment. And he was asked, well, which one? He goes, anyone. He also told the story of driving in the car with his wife and listening to the radio, and they were talking about some poll where people called in their opinions, in favor or against, whatever it was, or not decided. And he said to his wife, why would anyone call in and say they're not decided? And his wife replied, maybe they were a judge. But in addition to humility, I think that Chesterton demonstrates all the other virtues as well. He certainly has that heavenly virtue of patience, which counters the deadly sin of wrath. We cannot even say the word patience without mentioning Job. And that's Chesterton's favorite book of the Bible, incidentally. It's the book about the riddle of suffering. Patience means suffering, the pain of waiting for a relief, for a solution, for an answer that isn't coming. And those who have the virtue of patience are the ones who are most tested with suffering. Chesterton says the whole lesson of the book of Job is it's not that God chooses a bad man to suffer, but he chooses a good man to suffer. It's a paradox, of course. And Chesterton says, man is most comforted by paradoxes. We can also see in Chesterton the virtues of kindness and generosity. He would give any excess money he had in his pockets to beggars. He never returned home with any money at all because he gave it all away. Whatever he didn't have, he said the most difficult thing is talking to the poor men that we meet. He said, I don't believe in scientific charity because that's as easy as writing a check. I believe in promiscuous charity because that means that really talking to the poor men that we meet. And he said if we really believed in democracy, we would not be debating about what to do with the poor. The poor would be debating about what to do with us. And Chesterton had no desire to be rich. He was very generous. And as for not having desire to rich, he was very content with less than enough. He was never really, during his professional life, almost never financially secure. He was, after all, a married man. But in Frances Chesterton's great defense, she did manage his money because he was perfectly incapable of managing it himself, and so she made sure that all the bills got paid, and then she was the one who gave him his allotment of cash each day, and he was expected to make do with that during the day. And like I said, whatever was left over, whatever he didn't spend, buying a round of beer for his colleagues, he'd give away. But he says the problem with being poor, or not being rich, he says, to be clever enough to get all that money, one must be stupid enough to want it. And he made his money doing what he was made to do, to write. And he gave away much more than his tithe. He paid for the education of nieces and nephews. He paid for the education of children of friends of his. He paid for other people's medical bills. But he was also very generous with his time, which is the greatest gift of all, and his talent, which was his great gift. He visited schools and hospitals and would give talks at charity events. He would donate articles and poems to publications that were published just for the sake of raising money. So if there was a contribution by Chesterton in these books, people would buy them. And so such causes as the Blinded Soldiers and Sailors Gift Book, the Belgian Relief Effort, Aid for the Relief of Russian Refugees, Aid for the Royal Victoria Hospital, and he even gave to the Titanic Disaster Relief Fund. And of course, he supported GK's Weekly, his newspaper, because it didn't ever make money. And in order to pay the printer's bills, he wrote Father Brown stories. Many people had to die to keep that magazine alive. It wasn't until his own mother died that he received an inheritance, and then he was financially secure for the rest of his life, which was only 3 more years. And during that time, the only thing he spent of the inheritance was to go on a couple of trips to Europe, and one of those trips was to Lourdes, because he was so sick that he was really hoping for a miraculous healing. He realized that he didn't have much time left. And then, of course, he certainly exhibited the heavenly virtue of chastity. In his famous essay, A Piece of Chalk, he talks about white being a color, not the absence of color, but something positive, not negative. Just as chastity is not simply the absence of vice, but something flaming, like Joan of Arc of Old Orleans. He says, I believe in monogamy as the one complete adventure of man. Isn't that a beautiful line? But the next one's even better. The reward of chastity is a clearness of the intellect. If we look around at our muddled world today, our muddled thinking world, and some of the strange rationalizations people make for their behavior, it's clear that these are unchaste minds who have their intellects clouded. That last line, perhaps most of all, demonstrates that Chesterton has that virtue of chastity. And he had an incredible clearness of intellect. But then, of course, the other virtue, the last one we have to discuss, is that virtue of temperance. It's a tough one in the case of Chesterton because he was, after all, fat. And so was Thomas Aquinas. And so was St. Pope John the 23rd. That's what Chesterton says about that. The thin monks were holy, but I'm sure the fat monks were holy and humble. Interesting enough, those who knew him closely, his wife, his best friends, Edmund Clearhue Bentley, his secretary, Dorothy Collins, all of them testified the fact that he did not eat a lot. They marveled at how little he ate. So he was not a glutton in any way. Clearhue Bentley said he probably had a glandular condition that was responsible for most of his great size. But of course, that great size, he said, always gave something to talk about, and also was responsible for him being, as he said, the politest man in all of England, because he could stand up on a bus and offer his seat to 3 women at one time. It all comes back to humility, doesn't it? The saints are the ideal, which means they're the standard. I wish there were an ideal postman, an ideal grocer, an ideal plumber. It is undoubtedly true that we should laugh at the idea of an ideal postman. It's true. It proves that we are not genuine Democrats. That's a small d. Someone who believes in democracy. There certainly should be an ideal image of health and happiness in any trade, but although no ideal obliterates the ugly drudgery and detail of any calling, it is a serious calamity that no such ideal exists in the case of the vast number of honorable trades and crafts on which the existence of the modern city depends. It's a pity that current thought and sentiment offer nothing corresponding to the old conception of patron saints. If they did, there would be a patron saint of plumbers. And this would alone be a revolution, for it would force the individual craftsman to believe that there was once a perfect being who did actually plumb. And there might be plumbers who charge reasonable prices, too. It's possible. By the way, that line was not written by a Catholic. That was written by G.K. Chesterton before he was a Catholic. And it was from, the defendant. And we need more lay saints. I think that's an important point here. We need more models among lay people of holiness and of the ideal for the rest of us, the most of us who are lay people. Speaking as a Catholic, giveaway here. This was written by a Catholic. I'm very proud and happy to say that I know of no reason in heaven or earth why a barmaid should not sometime or other be canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. It's simply a question of in what way, with what motives, and in what spirit she minded the bar. Now, saints are heroes, but they're different from heroes. Saint worship is not like hero worship. For hero worship generally means the absorption or transmutation of some part or at any rate of one's own original ideas of goodness under the heat and hypnotism of some strong personality. But saint worship, especially when it's the worship of saints whom we know little or nothing about, is simply the worship of that tradition of goodness in which the saint's name has been embalmed. And into that empty mold, our own natural idealism can much more be easily poured. The invocation of saints, whether it be wise or no, is much less idolatrous than the invocation of historical heroes. Am I I still on this here? Okay, good. For you can only admire the goodness of a saint, whereas you may come to admire the badness of a hero. You may get all kinds of dangerous bias and sophistry and bad advice from the man in history whom you know nothing about. You can... Thus, to take the historical Saint George, if all we know about him is that he was killed for his opinions, that fact is properly considered so staggering that it might send us all singing into battle. Or take rather the legendary St. George, whom I need hardly say is very much more important than the real one. St. George knew very well what all real soldiers know, that the only way to be even approximately likely to kill a dragon is to give the dragon a heavy chance of killing you. And this method, which is the only one, is much too unpleasant even to be talked about. You see, I'm making a character of St. George at my own will and fancy. That's the whole point and advantage of an unknown saint. That's why saint worship is much more free than hero worship. Yes, he was not Catholic when he wrote that. But it's an interesting perspective. It was from an Illustrated London News article. He says that other religions have their saints, their religious heroes, their heroic representatives who live out their faith. But the Catholic saint is different, and everyone knows it. In fact, Chesterton doesn't really sound that ecumenical when he compares the Catholic saints with the other heroes of other religions, especially when it comes to Buddhism. He says, no two ideals could be more opposite than the Christian saint in a Gothic cathedral and a Buddhist saint in a Chinese temple. The opposition exists at every point, but perhaps the shortest statement of it is that the Buddhist saint always has his eyes shut, while the Christian saint always has them very wide open. The Buddhist saint has a sleek, harmonious body, but his eyes are heavy and sealed with sleep. The medieval saint's body is wasted to its crazy bones, but his eyes are frightfully alive. There cannot be any real community of spirit between the forces that produced symbols so different as that. And there you have the source. It's from Orthodoxy. He wasn't a Catholic when he wrote it. But it's in that same chapter where he says, there are some people who consider Buddhism and Christianity to be exactly the same, especially Buddhism. Now, we've heard a little bit about what Chesterton says about the saints. Let's hear briefly from what a couple of people said about Chesterton. William R. Titterton was a longtime colleague of Chesterton's, and he worked as the managing editor of both The New Witness and GK's Weekly. He was a Catholic convert as a result of knowing Chesterton, and he also wrote the first biography of Chesterton. So he knew him very intimately. And this is what he says. There are some people who think that Gilbert Keith Chesterton did not know suffering in his life. This is entirely untrue. He was for a long time a sick man, but he never showed the peevishness and irritability that others would show. People who are unable to take any interest in anything but their own insides. The only part of his inside that occupied the attention of GKC was his immortal soul. He died working. I'm rather inclined to call that heroic. GKC would not count his pains as suffering. He suffered far more truly and deeply when he lost a friend, for friendship was his daily bread. He suffered most of all when he lost his brother in the war. You see, though that loss wounded him almost to death, he never exhibited his wounds. I think that he was always telling himself that sorrow counted for nothing against the sorrow of the garden, and that his anguish was as nothing compared with the anguish upon the tree. For you see, to him, religion was the one burning reality of life. I will admit that I have strong hopes that it will one day be acknowledged that GKC died a saint. I don't know of all what the church requires to name someone a saint, but it seems to be at least that a saint is someone who always thinks about God. As long as I knew him, G.K. Chesterton was always thinking about God. Father Vincent McNabb was a Dominican priest. And when I say Dominican, he was actually a Benedictine, wasn't he? Order of Preachers? Who's that? That's what I said, Dominican. And once a week, he'd walk from his friary in Hyde Park, to Hyde Park, where he'd preach an open-air sermon or take questions from hecklers as he defended the Catholic faith. He would never lace up his boots in case he got thrown into the River Thames on his way back to the priory. Father McNabb should be a saint. Chesterton called him the greatest man in all of England. Incidentally, Father McNabb called Chesterton the greatest man in all of England. And he said here, it was hard to speak with Gilbert Chesterton and not think of God. Even the atheist who spoke with him, who would have despised the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, felt he would like to know about the God of Gilbert Chesterton. This God whom the very laughter of Gilbert Chesterton seemed to prove was such a lovably human, though transcendent being. So here we've heard two friends and colleagues of Chesterton and their two testimonies. One says Chesterton was always thinking about God, and the other who said he was always making other people think about God. Is Chesterton a saint? Of course he is. Yeah. We're just waiting for the church to make it official, and that's what we do. And we have every reason to believe that the day is coming very soon when his cause will be opened. I can't announce anything right now, but I can tell you the momentum is building. Some of you have heard this story, but I'll tell it again very briefly. In my own path to Rome, when I first heard someone propose that Chesterton be canonized, I had an epiphany. I was a Baptist. There's no place in our theology for the communion of saints. But I understood immediately, in a twinkling of an eye, what the communion of saints meant. I meant, oh yeah, saints don't get between you and Christ. They bring you closer to Christ. That yes, saints are your advocate. You ask someone you trust to pray for you, someone reliable and faithful to pray for you. The prayer of a righteous man has great power in its effects. And yeah, I could understand why I would ask Chesterton to pray for me. And I had no doubt that he would be my advocate because he proved himself to be my friend. And that I had no doubt he was in the presence of God. And I had an understanding that every saint has a cultus around him. And I understood that I belonged to the cult of Chesterton, and I was okay with that. And I heard it, and I said, this is fantastic. What a great idea. Whereas, back in those days, there were only about 14 of us in the world who were interested in Chesterton, and most of them were Catholic. And they said, no, that would be a bad idea if Chesterton were canonized. It would make him too Catholic. It would alienate people like Dale here. And I said, you've got to be kidding. I said, really? Really? I said, our idea of saints is that they're all 14-year-old barefoot girls, You need more 300-pound cigar-smoking saints. And I said, if you did that, that would help draw people to the Catholic Church. I said, in fact, if you canonize Chesterton, I'll become Catholic. And no one did anything. I expected a limo to pull up and said, Dale, we're going to escort you over to the Catholic Church. We've made arrangements for Chesterton to be canonized. No. I had to become Catholic through the normal channels. And then, even more ironically, I had to be the guy to get the cause going, which has been my great, great pleasure to do. How many here are Catholic converts tonight? That's a fair number. All right. How many of you are converts because of some connection with G.K. Chesterton? That's a good number, too. Yeah. I've met two of you tonight, the two sisters from Las Vegas. It's Kieran and was it Christina? Christelle. That's a great name. Anybody could remember Christelle, but nobody can remember Christina, and I chose the wrong one. Yeah. Just both received into the church within the last year because of reading Chesterton. How about that? Yeah. And as I say, the popular momentum is building. Some of you have seen or heard or have a tiny saint, the G.K. Chesterton, this wonderful little key fob there. He's kind of this juvenile version of each saint, and he's got a little cigar in his mouth there, and it's so cool, a juvenile cigar. I love that. And if you want one of these, just go out to our table and make a little $5 donation, and you get to walk away with a tiny saint, Chesterton. But wait a minute, you're saying Chesterton's not a saint. Yeah, I know exactly. But this organization that makes these things, this is the only one they have of someone who isn't canonized or beatified, is this guy right here. So he's already by popular acclamation being declared a saint. So get yours, and your donation will go towards the work of getting him beatified. Yes. And what a paradox. Chesterton, a tiny saint. But, why are we here? Why are we here? For 44 years, our conference has been meeting because we enjoy Chesterton. We enjoy the fellowship, and we enjoy the intellectual stimulation. We enjoy the great lines. We certainly enjoy each other. We enjoy having a good drink together, too. Let's face it. But we are enjoying the fact that Chesterton brings us closer to God. That's why we're here. He illuminates everything with an eternal light, and that lifts our spirits. And that's why we come back each year. It's a spiritual retreat. It's an uplift. We keep studying Chesterton. But what's the real reason we're here? Because we're trying to get to heaven. We're trying to become saints. What a horrible thought. Obviously, when we think of saints, we think of suffering and blood and being drawn and quartered, or worse. The road to sainthood is full of obstacles. But sainthood means getting to heaven. That's our goal. It takes a long time to get to heaven. Obstacles on the way to heaven are the romance of spiritual existence. There are a variety of saints. Not all of them had their intestines pulled out. Hopefully a few of you will. But all saints have suffered in one way or another. And all of them have this in common. They were happy. Chesterton should be our model. He suffered. Yes, we understand that. But he understood the book of Job. That book in the Bible that we all avoid, along with Ezekiel and Habakkuk. Face it, you're Catholic, you avoid the entire Bible. But you don't get to heaven without being a saint. You don't get to heaven without being a saint. We all have to become saints. Everyone in heaven is a saint. And here's the thing about Chesterton. He was happy. And that's what draws us to him. That's what we want. And that's what we want to give others, is that great Catholic joy. He's the reason that I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in. God bless you all. Thank you very much. God bless. Thank you.